They thought she was just another forgotten old woman, a silver-haired lady in her 70s sitting alone at the corner table with her cup of black coffee and yesterday's newspaper, reading glasses perched on her nose. To them, she was invisible, harmless, an easy mark. So when the Crimson Hawks Motorcycle Club rolled into Murphy's Tavern that Thursday night, engines roaring like thunder across the gravel lot, they decided to have some fun with the old bird who didn't know when to leave. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Where the dim bar lights couldn't catch the details, they surrounded her table, knocked over her coffee, made crude jokes about senior citizens who couldn't take a hint. They thought that was the end of it. But what they didn't know was that Dorothy Henley had been the first woman to earn her place among the Navy SEALs, back when most people thought females belonged nowhere near special operations. She hadn't just survived the training that broke grown men. She'd learned how to dismantle threats without anyone ever seeing it coming. Now, before we show you the exact moment she turned their own arrogance against them and brought down an entire motorcycle gang without ever raising her fist, drop a comment telling us about a time someone underestimated you because of how you looked. Hit that subscribe button with the bell icon and buckle up, because this time, respect wasn't demanded. It was quietly, systematically earned in a way that made sure nobody would ever forget why you should never judge a book by its weathered cover. The autumn wind cut sharp across Millfield, Pennsylvania, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the distant rumble of Harley-Davidson engines. Murphy's Tavern sat like a tired sentinel on the edge of town, its neon beer signs flickering against windows that had seen better decades. The kind of place where locals came to forget their troubles and strangers learned to mind their own business. Dorothy Henley pushed through the heavy wooden door at exactly 6:30 p.m., same as she had every Thursday for the past 8 years since moving to Millfield. She wore a simple gray cardigan over dark slacks, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and sensible shoes that made no sound against the scarred hardwood floor. At 73, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that every step mattered, though most people just saw an elderly woman trying not to trip. The regular crowd barely glanced up. Murphy himself, a thick-set man with kind eyes and calloused hands, nodded from behind the bar as she claimed her usual corner table, the one with a clear view of both entrances and the back exit, though she'd never explained why she preferred that spot. To everyone else, it was just where the old lady liked to sit. She ordered her usual black coffee, pulled out Thursday's edition of the Millfield Gazette, and settled into her weekly routine of reading every article, even the classifieds. Her reading glasses caught the amber glow from the vintage light fixture overhead, and her fingers, still steady, still strong, turned each page with the methodical patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. Outside, the rumble grew louder. The Crimson Hawks had been terrorizing small towns across 3 counties for the better part of 2 years. 15 members strong, led by a man called Viper, who wore his criminal record like a badge of honor. They weren't your weekend warrior types who polished chrome on Sundays. These were the real deal. Drug runners, extortionists, men who'd learned that fear was currency and small-town bars were easy banks to rob. Tonight, they'd chosen Murphy's. The engines cut simultaneously as they pulled into the gravel lot, a coordinated silence that felt more threatening than the noise had been. Through the window, Dot watched them dismount, leather jackets adorned with skull patches, arms covered in tattoos that told stories of violence and time served, the kind of men who'd learned to read weakness from across a room and exploit it before their victims knew they were being hunted. Viper stepped through the door first, 6'4", beard braided with small bones, eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. His lieutenant, a wiry man they called Razor, followed close behind, already scanning the room like a predator, cataloging prey. Behind them came the rest, a parade of leather and steel and barely controlled aggression. The bar fell silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of Murphy's grandfather clock. Regular patrons suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The couple in the back booth studied their phones. Even Murphy himself seemed to shrink behind the bar, polishing the same glass over and over. But in the corner, Dorothy Henley continued reading her newspaper, turning pages with the same unhurried rhythm she'd maintained for the past hour. Her coffee cup sat half empty beside her, still steaming slightly in the cool air. She didn't look up when the bikers entered, didn't flinch when their boots thundered across the floor, didn't react when Razor's laugh cut through the silence like breaking glass. To the Crimson Hawks, she was perfect, alone, elderly, probably carrying a purse full of Social Security money and prescription bottles, the kind of target who would hand over everything without a fight, who would be too embarrassed or too afraid to call the police afterward. They'd played this game in dozens of small towns, and it always ended the same way. What they couldn't see, what nobody in that bar could see, was the way her eyes tracked their movements in the reflection of the window beside her table, how her breathing remained perfectly controlled despite the rising threat, how her left hand rested casually near the handle of her coffee cup, ready to move in ways that muscle memory had burned into her nervous system 35 years ago. The Crimson Hawks thought they'd found easy prey in a forgotten corner of a dying town. They had no idea they'd just walked into the hunting ground of a woman who'd been forged in water so dark and training so brutal that most of the men who'd attempted it beside her had washed out before the first week ended. Viper's shadow fell across her table as he approached, his crew spreading out behind him like a pack of wolves surrounding a lamb. Murphy's Tavern held its breath, waiting to see what happened when predators met what they thought was perfect prey. But Henley just turned another page of her newspaper, took another sip of her coffee, and prepared to remind them all why underestimation had always been her greatest weapon. The interior of Murphy's Tavern told stories in scuff marks and cigarette burns, each scratch on the hardwood floor a testament to 43 years of small-town life. Amber light filtered through stained glass lampshades, casting warm shadows across walls lined with faded photographs of local high school football teams and yellowed newspaper clippings celebrating long-forgotten victories. The air hung thick with the scent of aged whiskey and honest sweat, punctuated by the occasional sizzle from the kitchen where Murphy's wife grilled burgers that had kept the place alive through 3 recessions. Behind the mahogany bar, rows of bottles caught the light like amber jewels, some top shelf, most decidedly not, all of them reflecting the practical sensibilities of a town where people measured their drinks by value rather than vintage. A vintage Wurlitzer jukebox hummed quietly in the corner, its neon tubes casting rainbow patterns on the worn leather of the booth seats. The machine hadn't played a song in 20 minutes, but nobody had fed it quarters either. Thursday nights at Murphy's moved to their own rhythm, slower and more deliberate than the weekend crowds. Dorothy Henley had chosen this place deliberately 8 years ago when she'd first arrived in Millfield. Not for the atmosphere or the company, but for the sight lines. Her corner table offered an unobstructed view of the main entrance, the side door that led to the kitchen, and the emergency exit near the restrooms. Most patrons assumed she liked the quiet corner because it felt safer for an elderly woman dining alone. They weren't entirely wrong, though their understanding of what made her feel safe would have surprised them. She'd learned to read rooms the way other people read books. The regular who always sat at the third stool from the left, nursing the same beer for 2 hours while he worked up the courage to call his ex-wife. The young couple in booth 4 who met every other Thursday, wedding rings conspicuously absent, stealing moments they couldn't have at home. Murphy himself, whose easy smile masked the careful way. He monitored every conversation, every interaction, ready to intervene before trouble bloomed into something requiring police intervention. Tonight felt different, though. The regular crowd sensed it too. Conversations carried on in lower tones. Laughter came less easily, and more than one patron had glanced toward the windows when the distant rumble of motorcycles first echoed across the parking lot. Word traveled fast in small towns, and the Crimson Hawk's reputation had preceded them by several counties. Murphy had quietly moved the baseball bat from under the register to within easier reach, though he'd done it with the casual efficiency of a man rearranging inventory rather than preparing for war. The tavern's layout worked against quick escapes. One main entrance flanked by large windows that offered visibility but no protection. The kitchen exit led to an alley that dead-ended against the back wall of Peterson's hardware store. The emergency door by the restrooms opened onto the same parking lot, where 15 Harley-Davidsons now sat cooling, their engines ticking in the autumn air like mechanical heartbeats. Dorothy's newspaper lay spread across the scarred wooden table, creased from methodical reading. The Millfield Gazette wasn't much to look at, 12 pages on a good week, filled with local politics, high school sports scores, and advertisements for farm equipment. But she read every word, same as she had during her first week in town, when she'd been learning the rhythms of her new life. Back then, the routine had been therapeutic, a way to ground herself in the simple concerns of civilian existence after decades of briefings that dealt in life and death across multiple continents. Her coffee had gone lukewarm, but she continued sipping it at measured intervals. The cup, thick white ceramic with Murphy's Tavern printed in faded blue letters, felt substantial in her hands. Honest craftsmanship built to withstand the daily handling of working people who didn't have time for delicate things. She appreciated that. Too much of her former life had been built around equipment that looked impressive but broke under real pressure. The grandfather clock near the bar chimed 7 o'clock, its deep tone cutting through the ambient conversation. Murphy glanced up from the invoice he'd been studying, his eyes automatically sweeping the room in a security check that had become second nature over 4 decades of tavern ownership. The young couple was finishing their appetizers. The regular at the bar had finally pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over his ex-wife's contact number. 2 construction workers shared war stories from the highway project, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of men who trusted each other with heavy machinery. Normal Thursday night rhythms, except for the 15 motorcycles outside and the tension that had settled over the room like fog. Dorothy turned another page, her movements unhurried despite the approaching storm. She'd learned patience in places where impatience meant death, had mastered the art of appearing unremarkable while remaining absolutely aware of every variable in her environment. The skill had served her well during operations across 3 continents, and it served her equally well now in a small-town tavern where trouble was about to walk through the door. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending a scatter of leaves across the parking lot. Through the glass, she could see the bikers dismounting from their machines with the coordinated precision of a pack that had hunted together many times before. Their leather jackets bore patches that told stories of violence and territory claimed through intimidation. Crimson Hawks with smaller patches underneath indicating ranks and specialties within their particular brand of organized chaos. Inside Murphy's Tavern, the last few minutes of normal Thursday night routine played out in quiet conversations and the gentle clink of glassware. Outside, 15 men prepared to transform that normalcy into something else entirely. Dorothy Henley folded her newspaper neatly, placed it beside her coffee cup, and prepared to meet whatever came next with the same unshakable calm she'd carried from her first day of SEAL training to this moment 43 years later, in a small-town bar where nobody knew her real story. The first thing Viper noticed when he scanned Murphy's Tavern wasn't the exits or the potential witnesses. It was the money. His eyes, trained by 15 years of reading rooms for profit potential, cataloged assets with the efficiency of a practiced predator. The till behind the bar, probably holding $2,000 on a good night. The regulars nursing drinks, each wallet representing a week's wages from honest work. And in the corner, the silver-haired woman who screamed Social Security check and jewelry passed down through generations. "Look what we got here," Razor muttered, sliding up beside his leader, with the fluid movements of a man who'd learned to navigate tight spaces during his 8 years in Folsom. His eyes swept the room like a scanner, noting the trembling hands of the bartender, the way conversations had died mid-sentence, the careful stillness of people trying to become invisible. "Christmas morning, boss." Behind them, the rest of the Crimson Hawks filed through the entrance with practiced coordination. Tank, whose nickname came from both his build and his tendency to solve problems by running through them. Bones, whose skeletal tattoos ran the length of both arms, each one marking a rival who'd made the mistake of underestimating him. Snake, whose specialty with knives had earned him respect in 3 state penitentiaries. They moved with the casual confidence of men who'd never met meaningful resistance. Regular crowd looked soft, Tank observed, cracking knuckles that had broken more noses than he bothered counting. His voice carried despite his effort to keep it low, and he saw the bartender flinch at the sound. Good. Fear made everything easier. Viper's attention fixed on Dorothy Henley, still absorbed in her newspaper as if 15 armed bikers hadn't just claimed her space. He'd seen the type before. Elderly women who lived alone, who'd grown complacent in small towns where the worst crime was usually somebody's kid, spray painting the water tower. They carried cash because they didn't trust banks, wore jewelry because it made them feel dignified, and never fought back because they'd been taught their whole lives that compliance meant survival. "Look at Granny over there," he said, just loud enough for his crew to hear. "Probably got her whole pension in that purse. Wedding ring looks real, too. Probably been married 50 years to some farmer who left her everything when he died." Razor chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "She hasn't even looked up. Probably deaf. Or maybe she thinks if she ignores us, we'll go away." The truth was simpler and infinitely more dangerous than they understood. Dorothy Henley had cataloged each of them the moment they'd entered, their positioning, their movement patterns, the way they unconsciously deferred to the largest man, the telltale bulges that indicated concealed weapons. Viper carried a pistol in a shoulder holster under his left arm. Razor had a knife clipped inside his right boot. Tank's jacket hung too heavily on one side, suggesting something metallic in the pocket. She'd learned to read these details in training environments where missing such information meant failure, and failure meant starting over or washing out entirely. But to the Crimson Hawks, she represented everything they'd learned to exploit. Vulnerable, isolated, probably frightened, despite her apparent calm. They'd played this game in dozens of establishments across rural Pennsylvania, and it always followed the same script. Walk in with overwhelming force, identify the weakest targets, apply pressure until compliance became automatic. Most people folded at the first show of aggression. The ones who didn't usually changed their minds after a demonstration of what resistance would cost them. "She's reading the obituaries," Snake observed with amusement, noting the section of newspapers spread before her. "Probably checking to see if any of her friends died this week." "Maybe we should give her something fresh to read about," Bones suggested, his skeletal tattoos seeming to shift in the amber light. "Something with today's date on it." Viper studied her more carefully, noting details that his crew missed. She sat with perfect posture, unusual for someone her age. Her coffee cup was positioned precisely within easy reach of her left hand. Her reading glasses were expensive, the kind of titanium frames that suggested military or government background. But these observations only reinforced his initial assessment. A retired professional, probably a teacher or an administrator, someone who'd spent her career in environments where order mattered but violence was theoretical. "Look how she holds that newspaper," Tank said with derision. "Like she's reading something important instead of small-town gossip. Probably thinks the church bake sale is front-page news." What they couldn't see was the way her eyes tracked their conversation in the reflection of the window beside her table, how her breathing remained controlled despite the rising threat in the room, how her left hand rested near her coffee cup, not for comfort, but because ceramic shattered into useful shapes, and hot liquid could blind an attacker long enough to access other options. "I bet she's never seen real trouble," Razor continued, emboldened by her apparent obliviousness. "Lived her whole life in places like this where the biggest excitement is when someone's dog gets loose. Probably calls the police when teenagers play music too loud," Viper added, warming to the theme. "The kind who thinks a security system means locking her front door at night." They couldn't have been more wrong. Dorothy Henley had seen trouble in forms they couldn't imagine, had been trained to create it, contain it, and eliminate it in environments where backup was measured in hours rather than minutes, and mistakes had consequences that rippled across international boundaries. But their misreading of her capabilities was exactly what she'd counted on when she'd chosen this quiet corner of this forgettable tavern in this sleepy town. "Easy money," Tank concluded, already mentally dividing the evening's potential take. "Probably got enough in that purse to keep us in gas for a week." As they prepared to make their move, Dorothy Henley calmly folded her newspaper, placed it beside her coffee cup, and prepared to demonstrate just how expensively their assumptions were about to cost them. The approach began with calculated intimidation, the kind Viper had perfected across dozens of small-town establishments. He nodded to Razor and Tank, a silent signal that sent them circling toward Dorothy's table from different angles while he took the direct route. The movement was designed to overwhelm. No escape routes, no friendly faces to appeal to, just the crushing weight of superior numbers closing in around a solitary target. "Evening, ma'am," Viper said, his voice carrying the false courtesy that made threats sound like conversations. He stopped just close enough to cast a shadow across her newspaper, forcing her to acknowledge his presence whether she wanted to or not. "Mind if we join you? Seems like you got the best seat in the house." Dorothy looked up from her paper with the mild expression of someone interrupted during a pleasant activity. Her blue eyes, still sharp despite her 73 years, met his gaze without flinching. "I'm sorry, but I prefer to read alone," she said, her voice carrying the polite firmness of a retired schoolteacher addressing unruly students. "Perhaps you gentlemen could find another table." Tank snorted with amusement. "Lady, you don't get to choose. We're not asking permission." "That's not very neighborly," Razor added, sliding closer until he could rest one leather-gloved hand on the back of her chair. "See, we're new in town, and we're looking for some local hospitality. Maybe you could help us understand how things work around here." The rest of the Crimson Hawks had spread throughout the tavern now, not quite surrounding the other patrons, but making it clear that leaving would require passing through them. Murphy stood frozen behind the bar, his hands visible and empty, calculating whether reaching for the phone would escalate the situation beyond his ability to control it. The construction workers had gone silent, studying their beers with the intense focus of men who'd learned when to avoid eye contact. "I'm afraid I can't help you," Dorothy replied, her tone remaining conversational despite the closing circle of leather and metal. "I keep to myself mostly, don't really know much about local hospitality." "Oh, I think you know more than you're letting on," Viper said, reaching out to straighten her reading glasses with one thick finger. The gesture was intimate and threatening, designed to establish dominance through unwanted touch. "Nice glasses, expensive looking. Bet everything about you is quality, isn't it?" Instead of pulling away, Dorothy simply removed her glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them in her cardigan pocket. The movement was unhurried, almost meditative, as if she were following a routine she'd performed countless times before. "Thank you for noticing," she said. "I do try to take care of my things." Tank leaned over the table, his massive frame blocking her view of the rest of the tavern. "Speaking of taking care of things, that's a real nice purse you got there. Real leather, looks like. Must have cost a pretty penny." "It was a gift," Dorothy said, her hands remaining folded in her lap, making no move to protect the handbag beside her chair. "From my late husband. He always said quality was worth the investment." "Smart man," Razor said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Bet he taught you to be practical too, to understand when you're outnumbered, when fighting back would just make things worse for everyone." "He did teach me about being practical," she agreed, and for the first time something shifted in her tone. Not fear, something cooler, more calculating. He used to say that the best way to handle bullies was to give them exactly what they deserved. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Viper felt it first, a slight alteration in the atmosphere that he couldn't quite identify. The old woman's posture hadn't changed. Her expression remained pleasant, but something fundamental had shifted, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air itself seems to hold its breath. "What's that supposed to mean?" Tank demanded, straightening slightly. For the first time since entering the tavern, he felt the need to look around, to check his positioning relative to exits and potential threats. "Nothing at all," Dorothy said, returning her attention to her coffee cup. She lifted it with steady hands, took a small sip, and set it down with the quiet precision of a chess player making an opening move. Just an old woman remembering old advice. But her eyes, when they flicked up to meet Viper's gaze, held something that made him take an involuntary step backward. Not fear, not submission, but the kind of cold assessment he'd seen in the eyes of men who'd killed before and would kill again if circumstances required it. For a moment, just a moment, he felt like prey instead of predator. "You know what I think?" he said, forcing aggression back into his voice to cover his momentary uncertainty. "I think you're playing games with us, acting all sweet and helpless when you probably got more money in that purse than most folks see in a month." "Money isn't everything," Dorothy replied, and now her voice carried an edge that cut through the ambient noise of the tavern like a blade through silk. "Sometimes what matters is understanding when you've made a mistake you can't take back." Razor's hand tightened on her chair, his knuckles whitening under the leather. "Are you threatening us, old woman?" Dorothy's smile was gentle, almost grandmotherly, but her eyes remained arctic. "Oh, no, dear, I don't make threats. I'm much too old for that sort of nonsense." She paused, took another sip of her coffee, and added with devastating quiet, "I just make observations." The silence that followed stretched taut as a wire, filled with the sudden understanding that something had gone terribly wrong with what should have been a simple intimidation. The Crimson Hawks had walked into Murphy's Tavern expecting to find easy prey, but Dorothy Henley's calm response to their threats suggested they'd found something else entirely, something that watched them with the patient attention of a predator that had already decided how this encounter would end. Outside in the parking lot, The autumn wind carried voices through the partially open window of Murphy's Tavern. 3 members of the Crimson Hawks, who'd stayed with the bikes, exchanged glances as they caught fragments of the conversation inside. Diesel, the club's enforcer, crushed his cigarette under his boot and motioned to the others. "This is taking too long," he muttered, checking his watch. "Boss said 5 minutes to scope the place. We been here 15. Wrench, whose nickname came from his preferred method of persuasion, spat into the gravel. "Maybe the old broad's putting up more fight than expected. Want me to go check?" "Nah," Diesel said, but his hand drifted toward the radio clipped to his vest. "Give 'em another minute, but something feels off." Inside, that same instinct was beginning to gnaw at Viper's confidence. The old woman's responses weren't following the script. Most targets either collapsed into pleading submission or tried desperate defiance. Both reactions he knew how to exploit. But Dorothy Henley sat there with the unshakable calm of someone who'd faced worse than anything he could imagine, and that realization was starting to crack his certainty. "Razor," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Dorothy. "Take Snake and Bones, check the exits. Make sure we got clear sight lines if this goes sideways." Razor hesitated for a split second, long enough for everyone to notice. "You think she's gonna cause trouble? She's 70 years old." "Just do it," Viper snapped, his voice sharper than intended. The command carried across the tavern, making the other patrons flinch and Murphy's grip tighten on the towel he'd been using to nervously clean glasses. As the 3 bikers moved to secure the tavern's perimeter, Tank leaned closer to Dorothy's table. "You hear that, Grandma? My boys are making sure nobody leaves until we're finished here. So whatever game you think you're playing, it's time to cash out." Dorothy's response was to calmly reach for her purse. Not to surrender it, but to extract a small leather wallet. She opened it with deliberate slowness, revealing not the expected driver's license and credit cards, but a military ID that caught the light from the overhead lamp. Even upside down, Tank could make out the eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marine Corps, though the details were obscured by the protective plastic sleeve. "What the hell is that?" Tank demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Old habits," Dorothy replied, closing the wallet and returning it to her purse. "Some people carry pictures of their grandchildren. I carry reminders of who I used to be." Viper moved closer, trying to process this new information. Military background could mean anything. Desk job, supply clerk, some administrative role that earned her a pension, but no real combat experience. Plenty of old-timers carried their service records around like badges of honor, even if they'd never seen anything more dangerous than a paper cut. "Marines, huh?" he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "What did you do? Type up reports, answer phones?" "Something like that," Dorothy agreed, but her tone suggested layers of meaning he wasn't equipped to understand. "Though I did travel quite a bit. Saw some interesting places." "Yeah? Like where?" Tank challenged, still trying to regain the psychological advantage that seemed to be slipping away moment by moment. Dorothy's eyes grew distant, as if she were looking at something far beyond the walls of Murphy's Tavern. "Oh, you wouldn't know them. Little places mostly. Places that don't show up on tourist maps." What she didn't say, what she would never say in a place like this, were the names that lived in classified files buried so deep that most of the people who'd authorized those missions were long since dead. Operation Nightfall in Somalia, where she'd spent 3 days behind enemy lines calling in precision strikes. The extraction mission in Bosnia that had saved 42 civilians from ethnic cleansing. The counter-terrorism operation in the Philippines that had prevented a bombing campaign across Southeast Asia. "Sounds boring," Razor called from his position near the emergency exit, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Bet you spent most of your time on some base filing paperwork. Filing was part of it, Dorothy acknowledged with a slight smile, though some of my files were more interesting than others. Snake had positioned himself by the kitchen door, effectively cutting off Murphy's access to the back office phone. But as he watched the conversation play out, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The old woman wasn't shrinking under their pressure. If anything, she seemed to be growing more composed, more focused, as if their threats were clarifying something in her mind. "Boss," he called quietly to Viper, "maybe we should just take what we came for and split. This feels wrong." "Nothing's wrong," Viper insisted, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "She's just trying to psyche us out with military stories, probably never left the States." Dorothy finished her coffee with unhurried precision, set the cup down, and looked directly at Viper for the first time since the conversation began. When their eyes met, he saw something that made his blood freeze, the same cold calculation he'd witnessed in the eyes of lifers in maximum security, men who'd learned to kill without hesitation and live without regret. "You're absolutely right," she said quietly. "I never should have left the States, but sometimes duty calls you to places where the rules are different, where you learn things that civilian life doesn't prepare you for." She paused, letting that sink in, then added with devastating gentleness, "Things like how to read a room full of predators and determine which one dies first." The temperature in Murphy's Tavern seemed to drop 10 degrees. Even the background noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock, seemed to fade into silence as 15 hardened criminals suddenly realized they might have cornered something far more dangerous than they'd bargained for. The atmosphere in Murphy's Tavern had shifted from predatory confidence to something approaching uncertainty. Viper felt it first, the subtle change in his crew's body language, the way Snake kept glancing toward the exits, how Razor's hand had moved to rest on the knife in his boot. Even Tank, who'd bulldozed through every confrontation in his adult life, seemed less sure of his footing. But retreat wasn't in their vocabulary. The Crimson Hawks had built their reputation on the principle that backing down from anyone, especially a 73-year-old woman in a small-town bar, would destroy the fear that kept their operation profitable. Word traveled fast in the criminal underground, and signs of weakness invited challenges they couldn't afford. "All right," Viper said, his voice taking on the hard edge that had intimidated judges, prison guards, and rival gang members across 3 states. "Enough games. You want to play war stories? Fine, but this conversation ends with you opening that purse and showing us what's inside." He reached across the table and knocked over Dorothy's empty coffee cup, the ceramic clattering against the wooden surface with a sharp crack that made Murphy flinch behind the bar. Coffee dregs spread across the newspaper she'd been reading, turning headlines into brown smears. "Oops," he said with theatrical menace. "Looks like you're gonna need a new paper, maybe some new glasses too if you keep playing hard to get." Dorothy watched the coffee spread across the sports section, her expression unchanged. She made no move to clean it up, showed no anger at the destruction of her property. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and waited, as if this moment had been inevitable from the second they'd walked through the door. "Tank, help the lady understand we're serious," Viper commanded. Tank grinned and grabbed the back of Dorothy's chair, tilting it backward until she had to grip the armrests to keep from falling. The move was designed to create helplessness, to remind her how easily they could escalate from verbal threats to physical violence. "Careful there," he said with mock concern. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself, though I hear old bones break real easy." From her tilted position, Dorothy looked up at him with the same calm expression she'd maintained since their arrival. "You know," she said conversationally, "in my experience, the people who talk the most about breaking bones usually have the least understanding of how it actually works." Tank's grin faltered. What's that supposed to mean? Oh, just that real violence isn't theatrical, she replied, as if discussing the weather. It's quick, precise, and usually over before the victim realizes what's happening. All this talking you're doing, this posturing, it tells me you've probably never been in a real fight. The insult hit its target. Tank's face flushed red, and he jerked the chair upright so violently that Dorothy's teeth clicked together. Lady, I've put more people in the hospital than you got years left to live. I'm sure you have, Dorothy said agreeably, though I suspect most of them were either much smaller than you or significantly outnumbered. Am I right? Bones moved closer from his position by the jukebox, his skeletal tattoos seeming to writhe in the amber light. She's trying to get inside your head, Tank. Don't let some old broad mess with you. But the damage was already done. Dorothy's calm dissection of their capabilities had planted seeds of doubt that were beginning to sprout. These weren't the reactions they were used to. Fear, pleading, desperate attempts at negotiation. This felt more like a job interview where they were failing to meet the requirements. Here's what's gonna happen, Viper said, pulling out a folding knife and setting it on the table where the blade caught the light. You're gonna open that purse, empty your pockets, and hand over anything valuable. Then you're gonna sit here real quiet while we collect from the rest of the customers. And if you cause any problems... You'll cut me? Dorothy interrupted, glancing at the knife with professional interest. That's a nice blade. German steel, if I'm not mistaken, though the handle's been modified, wrapped in that rubber grip tape. That suggests you're worried about it slipping when it gets wet. Viper blinked, momentarily thrown off by her technical assessment. So it tells me you've thought about this, planned for blood, which means you're not just carrying it for intimidation. She paused, studying his face with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. The question is whether you've ever actually used it on someone who could fight back. The tavern had gone dead silent except for the tick of Murphy's grandfather clock and the distant rumble of Harley engines in the parking lot. Every patron, every biker, even Murphy himself, seemed frozen as they watched this impossible conversation unfold between a senior citizen and a room full of criminals. Razor stepped closer to the table, his own knife now visible in his hand. She's stalling, boss, trying to talk her way out of this. No, Dorothy said quietly, her eyes never leaving Viper's face. I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything. I'm just curious about your methodology. See where I come from? We were taught that unnecessary violence was a sign of poor planning. That if you had to hurt someone to get what you wanted, you probably hadn't thought the situation through properly. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. So I'm wondering, did you gentlemen think this through? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you walked into a situation you don't fully understand, escalated it beyond your ability to control, and now you're committed to a course of action that's going to end very badly for someone. Snake's radio crackled to life from his position by the kitchen door. Everything good in there? You're taking forever. The voice belonged to Diesel, still outside with the bikes, and it carried a note of concern that suggested even the external security was beginning to sense something wrong. Viper grabbed the radio before Snake could respond. Everything's fine, he said, but his voice carried tension that contradicted his words. Give us 5 more minutes. Copy that, came the reply, but the extended pause before the response suggested Diesel wasn't entirely convinced. Dorothy listened to this exchange with the air of someone collecting final pieces of intelligence before making a decision. When the radio went silent, she looked around the table at the faces surrounding her. Tank's sweating aggression, Razor's nervous energy, Bones's growing uncertainty, and Viper's dawning realization that this wasn't going according to plan. 5 minutes, she repeated thoughtfully. That should be more than enough time. The escalation came with brutal swiftness, born from Viper's growing desperation to reassert control over a situation that had somehow slipped through his fingers. The old woman's psychological warfare had rattled his crew, and in the criminal hierarchy of the Crimson Hawks, showing weakness in front of subordinates was a death sentence for leadership. "Enough," he snarled, lunging forward and grabbing Dorothy's wrist with enough force to leave bruises. "I'm done playing games with you, Grandma." He yanked her to her feet, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh screech that cut through the tavern silence like fingernails on a chalkboard. Dorothy didn't resist the rough handling, but neither did she show the expected fear. Instead, she studied his grip with the detached interest of a professional evaluating technique. "Textbook intimidation hold," she observed mildly, even as his fingers dug into her thin wrist. "Though your thumb placement is off. You're relying on brute strength rather than pressure point manipulation." The clinical assessment infuriated him. Tank stepped in from behind, wrapping one massive arm around her throat in a chokehold that should have sent her into immediate panic. But Dorothy's breathing remained controlled, her posture relaxed despite the obvious threat to her airway. "Feel that, old lady," Tank growled in her ear. "That's what happens when you mouth off to your betters." "Actually," Dorothy replied conversationally, her voice slightly hoarse but steady, "what I feel is approximately 47 pounds of pressure applied at the wrong angle. You're compressing the windpipe but missing the carotid arteries entirely. Sloppy technique for someone who claims to be experienced." Razor had moved to her left side during the initial grab, and now he pressed the point of his knife against her ribs, just below her cardigan. "Maybe this'll shut you up," he hissed. Real steel cuts through smart remarks pretty easy. The blade's pressure was enough to part the fabric of her sweater, revealing the white cotton blouse beneath. Dorothy glanced down at the weapon with professional curiosity rather than terror. "Cheap steel, actually," she corrected. "The edge is already starting to dull from that grip tape you wrapped around the handle. Poor maintenance will get you killed in a real fight." Murphy had gone white behind the bar, his hands trembling as he watched 3 hardened criminals manhandle an elderly woman in his establishment. The other patrons had pressed themselves back into their seats, trying to become invisible while this nightmare played out in front of them. Bones approached from the jukebox, cracking his knuckles with deliberate menace. "Boss, want me to show her what happens to people who don't know when to shut up?" Before Viper could respond, Snake's radio crackled again. "Status report," Diesel's voice demanded, carrying more urgency now. "Local PD just drove past on patrol. We need to wrap this up." The mention of police should have accelerated their timeline, pushed them toward immediate action rather than prolonged intimidation. But something in Dorothy's demeanor, her continued calm, her technical critiques of their methods, had infected them with uncertainty that made quick decisions impossible. "Tell him 5 more minutes," Viper ordered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "5 more for what?" Snake asked, voicing the question that was starting to plague all of them. "What are we actually doing here?" It was the wrong question to ask in front of a victim, and everyone knew it. Doubt was contagious, and Dorothy seized the moment with surgical precision. "You're hesitating," she observed quietly, despite Tank's arm still around her throat and Razor's knife still at her ribs. "That's interesting. In my experience, hesitation during a committed action usually indicates incomplete planning or inadequate intelligence about the target." "Shut up," Viper snapped, but the words came too quickly, too defensively. "For instance," Dorothy continued, her voice taking on the tone of a lecture delivered to particularly slow students, "you assumed I was isolated, vulnerable, and incapable of resistance. But you never actually verified those assumptions, did you? Tank tightened his grip on her throat, cutting off her air supply more effectively this time. I said, "Shut up." Dorothy's response came in a voice strained by restricted airflow, but still maddeningly composed. You also assumed that creating witnesses in a public establishment was worth the risk, that local law enforcement response time was manageable, and that your escape routes remained secure. She paused to take what breath she could manage, then delivered the observation that would haunt them for the rest of their shortened criminal careers. Those are a lot of assumptions to make without proper reconnaissance. The radio crackled a third time, Diesel's voice now openly worried. "Boss, we got company. 2 patrol cars just pulled into the hardware store lot across the street. They're not moving, but they're watching." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This time, no one tried to respond immediately. The Crimson Hawks exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their deteriorating situation. What had started as a simple intimidation and robbery was turning into something far more complicated, with law enforcement already positioning for observation, if not intervention. "How?" Viper demanded, his knife hand beginning to shake as adrenaline and confusion warred in his system. "How did they know?" Dorothy smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, an expression that somehow managed to be both grandmotherly and terrifying. "Oh, they didn't know anything. This is just what happens when you operate in a small town without understanding how small towns actually work." She gestured slightly toward Murphy with her free hand, the movement barely visible despite her restraints. "Bartenders in places like this have protocols. When trouble walks through the door, they follow procedures that were established long before you were born." Murphy's face confirmed the truth of her statement. His earlier nervousness hadn't just been fear. It had been the tension of a man following a carefully rehearsed emergency plan that he'd hoped never to implement. "Silent alarm," Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger despite Tank's continued pressure on her throat. "Probably triggered the moment you spread out to secure the exits. Standard small business security protocol in rural areas where police response times are longer." The implications hit them like cold water. They weren't just dealing with an unexpectedly resilient victim. They were operating in a trap that had been closing around them since the moment they'd decided this elderly woman represented easy prey. Outside, the rumble of their Harley engines continued, but now it sounded less like power and more like a countdown to capture. The realization that they'd walked into a trap should have triggered immediate panic, demands for hostages, or a desperate rush for the exits. Instead, something else happened in Murphy's Tavern, something that would puzzle law enforcement investigators for months afterward. Rather than escalate their violence or attempt to flee, the Crimson Hawks found themselves paralyzed by Dorothy Henley's continued composure in the face of what should have been overwhelming force. Tank's arm remained locked around her throat, Razor's knife still pressed against her ribs, and Viper's grip on her wrist hadn't loosened, but their confidence had evaporated like morning mist. The old woman's technical dissection of their methods, her casual mention of reconnaissance and tactical planning, had planted seeds of doubt that were now flowering into something approaching fear. "You're thinking about it now, aren't you?" Dorothy said quietly, her voice slightly strained but perfectly audible despite Tank's chokehold. "Wondering what else you might have missed, what other assumptions you made without verification." "Stop talking," Viper ordered, but the command lacked authority. For the first time in his criminal career, he was beginning to understand that intimidation was a two-way street, and somehow this elderly woman had turned the psychological warfare back on them. Dorothy's eyes moved, systematically from face to face, cataloging their growing uncertainty with the methodical precision of a field operative gathering intelligence. For instance, you assumed I was alone. But did you actually verify that? Did you conduct surveillance before entering? Did you check the parking lot for vehicles that might indicate backup or support? Snake shifted nervously by the kitchen door, his radio silent for the moment, but his eyes constantly flicking toward the windows, where police cars were presumably still watching. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Should what?" Dorothy interrupted gently. "Cut your losses, attempt to negotiate, or perhaps you're considering escalation?" She turned her attention to Razor, whose knife hand had begun to tremble slightly. "Are you actually prepared to use that weapon? Because once you cross that line, there's no going back to simple intimidation and theft." Razor's grip on the knife shifted, uncertainty making his movements clumsy. "You think I won't cut you?" "I think," Dorothy replied with devastating calm, "that you've never killed anyone who wasn't already restrained or outnumbered. I think you've built your reputation on intimidating people who were already beaten before you pulled a weapon, and I think you're beginning to realize that this situation is nothing like those others." The psychological pressure was working both ways now. While the bikers maintained physical control, Dorothy was systematically dismantling their mental equilibrium with observations that cut too close to uncomfortable truths. Each technical critique, each casual reference to tactical concepts they didn't fully understand, reinforced the growing suspicion that they'd cornered something far more dangerous than an elderly civilian. Murphy watched this impossible chess match from behind his bar, his hands still shaking, but his eyes sharp with growing understanding. The woman he'd served coffee to every Thursday for 8 years was revealing layers of capability that had been hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade of harmless routine. "You know what I think happened here," Dorothy continued, her breathing steady despite Tank's continued pressure on her throat. "I think you gentlemen have been operating in environments where real resistance was theoretical. Small towns, isolated victims, people who'd been conditioned to believe that compliance was their only option for survival." She paused to let that assessment sink in, then delivered her next observation with clinical precision. "But you never learned to identify genuine threats, did you? Never developed the skills to distinguish between someone who couldn't fight back and someone who was choosing not to fight back yet." Bones had moved closer during the conversation, drawn by the same morbid fascination that makes people slow down at accident scenes. "What's the difference?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity beneath the attempted menace. Dorothy's smile was educational, almost patient. "Oh, about 30 years of training designed to turn human beings into precision weapons, the kind of education that teaches you to evaluate threats, calculate odds, and eliminate resistance before it becomes organized." Tank's grip loosened slightly, just enough for her to take a full breath. "You're bluffing," he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "You're just some old lady trying to psyche us out." "Am I?" Dorothy asked reasonably. "Then explain why you're all sweating despite the cool weather, why your hands are shaking, why you keep glancing toward the exits, even though you're supposedly in control of this situation." The truth was that Dorothy Henley was conducting a textbook psychological operation using the same principles she'd employed in hostile territories across 3 continents. The human mind, regardless of criminal experience, responded predictably to uncertainty and controlled fear, by demonstrating knowledge they didn't possess, by remaining calm under pressure they couldn't handle. She was creating doubt that would eventually paralyze their decision-making capabilities. Viper's radio crackled again, Diesel's voice now openly worried. "Boss, we got problems. Those patrol cars aren't alone anymore. I count at least 4 vehicles, maybe more, positioning around the block. This is starting to look like containment. The implications were clear to everyone in the tavern. What had started as a simple robbery was evolving into a standoff with law enforcement, and their window for escape was closing rapidly. But instead of triggering the desperate action that might have been expected, the news seemed to drain the fight out of the Crimson Hawks entirely. "How?" Viper demanded again, though his voice had dropped to a whisper. "How did this happen so fast?" Dorothy's expression remained serene, almost sympathetic. "Because you made the same mistake that gets people killed in my former profession. You confused tactical surprise with strategic advantage. Yes, you surprised me when you walked through that door. But surprise is only useful if you understand the operational environment you're entering." She gestured slightly with her free hand toward the windows, the movement barely perceptible despite her restraints. Small towns aren't anonymous urban environments where violence can occur without notice. They're interconnected systems where everyone knows everyone else's routines. When those routines are disrupted, people notice. When people notice unusual activity, they respond according to established protocols. The grandfather clock chimed 8 o'clock, its deep tone cutting through the tension like a bell tolling for the dead. Outside, the October wind had picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the distant sound of more vehicles arriving. Inside Murphy's Tavern, 15 hardened criminals were beginning to understand that they'd walked into a situation that had been carefully prepared for them by a woman who'd spent decades learning how to turn enemies' strengths into fatal weaknesses. The transformation began in silence, while the Crimson Hawks remained frozen in their tableau of implied violence. Tank's arm around her throat, Razor's knife at her ribs, Viper's grip on her wrist, Dorothy Henley began to move with the methodical precision of someone executing a plan that had been formulating since the moment they'd walked through Murphy's door. Her first action was barely perceptible, a slight shift in her breathing pattern that Tank, despite his arm around her throat, failed to notice. She was oxygenating her blood, preparing her system for the explosive action that would follow. The technique had been drilled into her during combat training decades earlier, when instructors had taught her that the difference between survival and death often came down to seconds of physiological preparation. Her second move was equally subtle. While maintaining her conversational tone, she began cataloging distances and angles with the systematic efficiency of a targeting computer. Razor's knife hand was positioned 2.3 inches from her ribcage, angled at approximately 45 degrees. Tank's arm crossed her throat at the level of her Adam's apple, providing leverage but leaving his left side exposed. Viper stood 18 inches away, his grip on her wrist strong but positioned in a way that actually gave her mechanical advantage if she chose to use it. "You gentlemen have about 90 seconds before this situation becomes irreversible," she said calmly, her voice betraying none of the tactical planning occurring beneath her conversational exterior. "I'd suggest you use that time to consider your options." Murphy, still behind the bar, noticed something the bikers missed. Dorothy's free hand had moved to rest against her cardigan pocket, fingers positioned over what looked like a simple button but which Murphy now realized might be something else entirely. The movement was natural, barely visible, but there was an intentionality to it that suggested preparation rather than nervous fidgeting. Snake's radio crackled with increasing urgency. "Boss, we got a problem out here. State police just arrived. They're setting up what looks like a perimeter. Whatever you're doing in there, you need to finish it now." The news should have prompted immediate action, but instead it seemed to paralyze the Hawks further. They were caught between their commitment to the robbery and their growing awareness that they were operating outside their expertise. Dorothy's continued calm in the face of their threats had infected them with uncertainty, and uncertainty was the enemy of decisive action. 90 seconds for what? Viper demanded, though his voice carried less conviction than before. For you to realize that this situation was never what you thought it was, Dorothy replied. Her tone remained educational, almost gentle, but her eyes had taken on a quality that Murphy recognized from nature documentaries, the focused attention of a predator that had finished stalking and was preparing to strike. She shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, redistributing her balance in a way that would give her maximum leverage for explosive movement. The technique was called loading the spring in special operations parlance, and it prepared the human body to generate maximum force in minimum time. You see, she continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of a briefing delivered to military personnel, you made several critical errors in your operational planning. First, you failed to conduct adequate intelligence gathering about your target. Second, you entered a tactical environment without understanding its parameters. Third, you committed to an action sequence without establishing clear exit criteria. Bones had been listening with growing fascination, drawn in despite himself by her technical language. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Dorothy said with devastating patience, that you're not criminals conducting a robbery. You're insurgents who've walked into a counterinsurgency operation that was designed specifically to neutralize people exactly like you. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. For the first time since entering Murphy's Tavern, the Crimson Hawks began to understand that they weren't predators. They were prey that had been carefully herded into a killing zone by someone who understood warfare at a level they couldn't comprehend. Murphy's hand had moved to a position beneath the bar, not reaching for a weapon but resting on what appeared to be a communications device. The movement was coordinated with Dorothy's timeline, suggesting a level of preparation that went far beyond standard small business security protocols. 60 seconds, Dorothy observed, glancing toward the clock. That's how long you have before the perimeter is complete and your mobility becomes permanently compromised. Tank's grip on her throat had unconsciously loosened as he processed the implications of her words. You're saying this whole thing was a setup? I'm saying, Dorothy replied with clinical precision, that small towns like Millfield have learned to protect themselves from predators like you, and sometimes that protection comes in forms you wouldn't expect. Her breathing had shifted again, preparing for action. Her muscles, despite her age, coiled with the remembered efficiency of combat training that had been reinforced through decades of practice. The woman who'd been sitting quietly with her newspaper and coffee was revealing herself to be something entirely different, a weapon that had been masquerading as a target. Razor's knife hand had begun to shake more noticeably now, the psychological pressure finally overwhelming his physical control. Boss, something's really wrong here. We need to go. Now. Go where? Viper asked, his voice cracking slightly. You heard. The radio. They've got us surrounded. Dorothy's smile was gentle, almost sympathetic. Not quite surrounded. Not yet. You still have about 45 seconds to make a choice that might preserve some possibility of escape. She paused, letting her eyes move from face to face one final time. But that window is closing rapidly, and once it closes, your options become much more limited. Outside, the sound of additional vehicles could be heard over the October wind. Inside Murphy's Tavern, the grandfather clock continued its relentless countdown toward 8:01, each tick marking another second stolen from whatever remained of the Crimson Hawks' criminal careers. Dorothy Henley took one final deep breath and prepared to demonstrate why underestimating elderly women had been the last mistake these particular predators would ever make. The explosion of action began not with Dorothy's movement, but with the simultaneous activation of every piece of technology in Murphy's Tavern that the Crimson Hawks had failed to notice during their tactical assessment. The button beneath Dorothy's fingers wasn't decorative. It was a military-grade panic beacon that sent an encrypted burst transmission to a network that existed far beyond local law enforcement capabilities. Within milliseconds, the Tavern's seemingly innocent security cameras revealed their true nature. High-definition lenses that had been recording every word, every gesture, every threat since the moment the bikers had entered. But more than just recording, they had been transmitting in real time to a command center that specialized in exactly this type of situation. The jukebox in the corner, silent for the past 20 minutes, suddenly came alive with a sound that wasn't music. A sharp, piercing tone that cut through the tension like a blade, followed by a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement. "Attention Crimson Hawks Motorcycle Club. This is Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. You are surrounded by federal agents. Release your hostage immediately and surrender yourselves." Tank's arm jerked away from Dorothy's throat as if he'd been electrocuted. Razor stumbled backward, his knife clattering to the floor as the implications hit him like a physical blow. Viper's grip on Dorothy's wrist loosened completely as he stared around the tavern with the expression of a man watching his world collapse in real time. But Dorothy herself moved with the fluid precision of someone who had been expecting exactly this moment. Her first action was to step clear of the confused bikers, creating distance that transformed her from victim to observer. Her second was to retrieve a small device from her cardigan pocket. Not a panic button, but a communication unit that had been recording and transmitting their entire conversation to the federal task force positioned outside. "Thank you for your patience, Agent Martinez," Dorothy said into the device, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism of someone accustomed to coordinating complex operations. "Subjects have provided comprehensive evidence of intent to commit armed robbery, assault, and intimidation of federal witnesses." The bikers stared at her in shock, their criminal minds struggling to process the magnitude of their miscalculation. Snake was the first to find his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Federal witnesses?" Dorothy's expression shifted from grandmotherly patience to something far more dangerous. "Did I forget to mention that? My apologies. When you choose to intimidate someone in a federal witness protection program, it tends to attract attention from people with very serious resources." Murphy stepped out from behind the bar, and for the first time, the bikers noticed the subtle bulge beneath his apron that suggested body armor. His nervous demeanor had evaporated, replaced by the alert professionalism of someone trained in crisis management. "Federal Marshal James Murphy," he announced, showing a badge that had been concealed beneath his bartender's facade. "This establishment has been a designated safe house for protected witnesses for the past 6 years. The other patrons in the tavern were revealing their true nature as well. The construction workers produced FBI credentials. The young couple in Booth 4 were DEA agents who had been conducting surveillance on motorcycle clubs throughout the region. Even the regular at the bar turned out to be a state police detective whose drinking problem was an elaborate cover for intelligence gathering. Bones looked around the tavern with dawning horror. "The whole place is fake?" "Not fake," Dorothy corrected gently, "just carefully managed. Murphy's Tavern serves real food to real customers 6 days a week, but on Thursdays it serves a different purpose. It provides a secure environment for protected witnesses to maintain normal social patterns while remaining under federal protection." Through the windows, the true scope of their predicament became visible. What the bikers had assumed were local police cars were actually unmarked federal vehicles. The patrol officers they'd glimpsed were tactical teams, positioned with military precision around the entire block. The hardware store across the street had been converted into a temporary command center, its windows now revealing communication equipment and personnel in tactical gear. Viper's hand shook as he realized the magnitude of their situation. "How long have you known we were coming?" Dorothy's smile was educational, almost pitying. "We've been tracking the Crimson Hawks for 8 months. Your pattern of targeting rural establishments, your preference for elderly victims, your operational timeline, all of it was documented and analyzed by federal investigators who specialize in organized crime." She gestured toward the spilled coffee and scattered newspaper on her table. "This particular operation has been in planning for 6 weeks, ever since our intelligence indicated you were moving into Pennsylvania. Every detail, my Thursday routine, the tavern's apparent vulnerability, even the positioning of other customers, was designed to present you with an irresistible target." Razor had sunk into a nearby chair, his face white with shock. "We walked right into it. More than that," Dorothy continued with devastating precision. "You provided us with enough recorded evidence to prosecute not just for tonight's attempted robbery, but for your entire pattern of criminal activity across 3 states. Your conversation here included confessions to multiple felonies, threats against federal witnesses, and conspiracy charges that will ensure none of you see freedom for decades." The radio on Snake's vest crackled one final time, but the voice that emerged wasn't Diesel's anymore. "Crimson Hawks members in the parking lot have been taken into custody without incident. Surrender immediately to avoid additional charges." Tank slumped against the wall, the fight gone out of him completely. "How? How did you know exactly what we'd do?" Dorothy's expression softened slightly, taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining a difficult concept to struggling students. "Because you followed a pattern, and patterns can be predicted by people trained to recognize them. You target the vulnerable, you use intimidation rather than planning, and you assume that elderly women in small towns represent easy prey." She moved to the window, looking out at the federal agents who were efficiently processing the bikers who'd been guarding their motorcycles. "What you never considered was that some elderly women in small towns might have spent their careers hunting people exactly like you." The grandfather clock chimed 8:15, marking the end of what had been intended as a simple robbery but had become a comprehensive federal sting operation. Outside, the October wind continued to blow, but inside Murphy's Tavern, the Crimson Hawks were learning that their criminal careers had just come to a permanent end. The federal agents who entered Murphy's Tavern moved with the synchronized precision of a military unit, each one knowing their role in the carefully choreographed aftermath of a successful operation. The Crimson Hawks offered no resistance as zip-tie restraints were applied and Miranda rights were read in voices that carried the weight of absolute authority. The transformation from predators to prisoners happened with such clinical efficiency that it felt almost anticlimactic after the psychological warfare that had preceded it. Dorothy Henley stood near the window watching as the last of the motorcycles was loaded onto federal transport trucks. The machines that had represented freedom and power to their owners now looked like museum pieces, evidence to be cataloged and stored until they could be auctioned off to help pay restitution to the Hawks, victims across 3 states. Agent Martinez approached her with the respectful deference reserved for operators who had earned their legend through decades of service in environments where mistakes meant body bags rather than reprimands. She was younger than Dorothy by 25 years, but her bearing suggested the kind of professional competence that comes from working with genuine experts. "Clean operation, Dorothy," Martinez said quietly. "The recording quality was perfect. Their confessions alone will support prosecution for the entire multi-state pattern. Add in the threats against a federal witness and the attempted robbery, and we're looking at life sentences for the leadership. Dorothy nodded, accepting the praise with the understated satisfaction of someone who had never needed external validation to know when she'd performed well. They made it easy. Criminals who rely on intimidation rather than intelligence usually do. She turned from the window to survey the tavern that had served as her hunting ground. The spilled coffee had been cleaned up, her newspaper disposed of, the chairs straightened. Within an hour, Murphy's would return to its normal function as a legitimate small-town bar, ready to serve customers who would never know that federal agents had just concluded a months-long investigation at Table 6. Murphy himself, Federal Marshal Murphy, was coordinating with local police to ensure that the cover story would hold. As far as Millfield's residents would know, a routine traffic stop had led to the arrest of a motorcycle gang on outstanding warrants. The truth about federal witness protection and elaborate sting operations would remain classified, protecting not just Dorothy's identity but the operational security of similar safe houses across the country. Tank, Viper, Razor, and the rest of the Crimson Hawks sat in the corner booth under federal guard, their earlier swagger replaced by the hollow expression of men processing the magnitude of their miscalculation. They had entered Murphy's Tavern as predators at the top of their criminal hierarchy. They would leave as defendants facing federal charges that would ensure their names became cautionary tales in law enforcement training academies. The irony, Dorothy observed to Agent Martinez, is that they were right about one thing. I really was just a retired military officer trying to read her newspaper in peace. Except for the part about being helpless, Martinez replied with a slight smile. Well, yes, that assumption proved somewhat inaccurate. The federal agents were conducting final evidence collection now, photographing the tavern layout, securing the audio and video recordings, cataloging the weapons and contraband seized from the bikers. Each piece would become part of a prosecution case that had been building for months, with tonight's operation serving as the capstone that would bring down not just the Crimson Hawks, but several associated criminal enterprises across the region. Dorothy retrieved her purse from the chair where it had sat throughout the confrontation, checking to ensure that nothing had been damaged during the brief physical altercation. The leather wallet that had revealed her military ID was actually a carefully constructed prop designed to support her cover identity, though the service record it contained was entirely authentic. "Will you be staying in Millfield?" Martinez asked as they prepared to conclude the operation. Dorothy considered the question seriously. She had grown fond of the small Pennsylvania town, of Murphy's Thursday evening routine, of the simple pleasure of reading local news without wondering if any of the headlines might affect national security. The witness protection program would offer her relocation if she felt her cover had been compromised, but that hardly seemed necessary. "I think so," she said finally. "The Crimson Hawks weren't specifically targeting me. They thought they were targeting a random elderly woman. My cover identity remains intact, and I've grown attached to Thursday evenings here." She looked around the tavern one final time, noting how quickly it had returned to normal after serving as the center of a major federal operation. The transformation spoke to the professionalism of everyone involved, but also to the strange duality of her retirement, moments of deadly serious operational work separated by months of genuine civilian tranquility. As the federal agents escorted their prisoners towards the transport vehicles, Dorothy caught Viper's eye one final time. The man who had led the Crimson Hawks looked at her with something approaching recognition, as if he was finally beginning to understand what they had actually encountered in Murphy's corner booth. "You really were reading the newspaper," he said, his voice carrying bewilderment rather than anger. "I really was," Dorothy confirmed, "though I must admit The obituaries were less interesting than your conversation. It was the last exchange between predator and prey, criminal and operator, intimidation and expertise. In the morning, the Millfield Gazette would carry a small item about a motorcycle gang arrested on outstanding warrants. It would not mention the federal investigation, the witness protection program, or the fact that 15 hardened criminals had been systematically destroyed by a 73-year-old woman who just wanted to finish her coffee in peace. Dorothy gathered her cardigan and prepared to walk home through the quiet streets of Millfield, past houses where families were settling in for normal Thursday evening routines. Tomorrow she would return to her civilian life, grocery shopping, library visits, the comfortable anonymity of retirement in a small town where her neighbors knew her as a polite elderly woman who kept to herself. But every Thursday at 6:30, she would return to Murphy's Tavern for coffee and the local newspaper, maintaining the routine that had served her well tonight and might serve her again if other predators made the mistake of assuming that elderly women represented easy prey. Because Dorothy Henley understood something that most civilians never learned. The most dangerous enemies were often the ones who looked exactly like everyone else, and the most effective weapons were patience, preparation, and the willingness to let arrogant men destroy themselves through their own assumptions about what constituted weakness. The October wind carried away the sound of federal vehicles departing Millfield, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of justice properly served and lessons permanently learned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.